Hey you guys, this is Mrs. Abbott, shaking things up with earthquakes here. I just want to give you guys a brief overview of earthquakes so you have the information you need, and you'll want to be taking notes with the shaken notes that are linked to the Schoology assignment. So the first question we should answer is, what is an earthquake? And the sort of simple explanation is that an earthquake is the rapid vibration of the earth created by a sudden movement of large sections of rock. So often this is related to plate tectonics, but the earth can vibrate for a number of reasons. Even a train on the tracks going by your house can cause the earth to vibrate, but usually that's not very sudden. Earthquakes generally are caused by tectonic forces, and when plates move, stress gets put on the rocks, and eventually those rocks break, and that causes a fault or a break in the rock. So this is a map that shows all the earthquakes and their epicenter locations from 1978 to 1987, so over a 9-year period. And I'm just wondering if you guys notice anything about sort of the lines that were drawn. And we discussed this in the activity we did in class today, but this idea that they actually all seem to be happening along plate boundaries. And occasionally you get them happening in the middle of plates, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The scientific explanation of an earthquake, and again, you don't have to write this down, is that we learned last unit that the earth has a bunch of heat in the internal parts of it, and that heat causes convection currents, and the hot mantle material rises, it goes to the top, cools and sinks, and it sort of moves around like putting on a stove. And that hot asthenosphere kind of has the plates kind of move along it like they're on a conveyor belt, and that's what causes plate tectonics. The speed of that motion is about as fast as your fingernails grow, so a couple centimeters per year. And the pressure from the movement creates these faults or big breaks in the rigid crust. And then when the rocks move and they actually break, those vibrations are what cause an earthquake. So this picture should look really familiar. You can see that there are shallow earthquakes here, there's deeper earthquakes at the subduction zone, there's shallow earthquakes at the transform boundary. But some vocabulary we should know is first a fault, and a fault is just the surface between two regions of rocks along which there's been a rupture and movement in the past. And that picture to the right here, is of the San Andreas Fault, and that's probably the most famous fault here in the United States. So a fault is just the surface between two regions of rock along which there's been a rupture and then movement in the past. And for those of you who learned about mountains last week, mountains are often built as a result of faults, but sometimes they're a result of folding, which is when there's bending in the rock but not a break. Shear strength is the force that's needed to break a solid material. We all know there are certain materials that are stronger than others. So for example, if I didn't want people to break my rulers, I'd probably not have them made out of plastic. I'd have them out of titanium, which has a higher shear strength. Elastic rebound is this idea that when you stress something a lot, like a rubber band, and you pull it, once you break it, it's the return of that bent elastic solid to its original shape after the stress or deformation process is returned. So this is showing some stress on some deformed rocks, and there's stress on them, it creates a fault, and there's a buildup of that strain, and eventually it slips and it releases all that stress, and everything sort of mellows out for a little bit, but there's still some movement sometimes. And finally, friction is that force that resists the motion of one surface against another. So as those plates on either side of the fault are rubbing against each other, friction is created, and that is what forms the tension that needs to get relieved by an earthquake. And that's just showing that there and the different plate boundaries. This diagram shows the process of elastic rebound. So we're going to sort of look starting at the bottom. Here's the Pacific Plate. There's the North American Plate. There's the San Andreas Fault. This is what this fence looked like when the farmer built it in the 1900s. As the Pacific Plate started to move northwest, it kind of distorted the fence. And then just before the earthquake, the fence had kind of that S shape that you can see here. When the earthquake occurred, that distortion gets released and the two parts of the fence are again straight, but they're kind of offset. And here's a real world picture. This fence got moved 8.5 feet in one earthquake after the San Francisco earthquake. The focus of an earthquake is where the slippage happens. It's the location in the earth where the underground rock moves and sends out earthquake waves. And this can be shallow or it can be deep, but it's the place under the Earth's surface that the slippage happens. And the epicenter is the location on the surface of the Earth directly above the focus of the Earth. And the relationship between the focus and the epicenter is shown here. So there's the focus underneath the Earth, there's the epicenter directly above. And the epicenter is not always right on the fault. So when the break line or the fault between the two blocks of rock suddenly moves, the movement causes vibrations that race rapidly outward in all directions from the focus, and the point at ground level directly above the focus is called the epicenter. There are three different types of waves that come from an earthquake. The first type are the body waves, and those are known as the P and S waves, and they can travel through the interior of the Earth, whereas the surface waves are what travel along the Earth's outer layer and usually cause the most damage. So P waves stand for primary waves, and you're going to be filling out the graphic organizer I have in the notes. And these are the fastest moving. They move about 6 kilometers per second. They're the first to be recorded at a seismograph station, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But primary stands for P. P stands for primary, so they're the first to get there. And they can travel through both solids and liquids, and this is important for going through the outer core, which is a liquid. And their effect is that they sort of push and pull. They kind of go back and forth, kind of like a slinky getting compressed and going out, and it causes the rock to move back and forth in the same direction that the wave is moving. Secondary waves come second to the seismograph station, and they move a little bit slower at 4 kilometers per second, but they can only travel through solids, so they can't go through the outer core. And their effect is that they go side to side, like this, like a snake slithering side to side, but still going forward. Sorry, that got blocked. But they go sort of side to side at right angles to the direction that they're traveling. So here's a quick animation of the two different sides. Waves, here's P waves. Notice they're kind of just going in the same direction as the wave travels, but the S waves kind of snake back and forth, and they go perpendicular to the direction of the movement. So this just shows you that this is an S wave, and it's going through the lithosphere and the asthenosphere right there, but it's not necessarily going to be able to go through the outer core. So here's another animation showing P and S waves. So notice how the S waves don't make it through the outer core because they can't go through the liquid. So I'll play that one more time. So both S and P waves travel throughout the body of the Earth. S waves can't travel through the core, and only P waves can be recorded in some places because of that. And that's kind of a cool picture showing that. There are certain places that don't end up getting any of the S waves because they're too far away from the earthquake. Surface waves are the slowest moving waves, and they're the last to be recorded on a seismograph. They can move through liquid and solid, but they never go through the Earth's inner core. But they cause the Earth's surface to actually rise and fall, and they're the ones that cause buildings to fall and things like that. Sometimes they're called long waves or L waves. So here are some pictures of the destruction that those waves can cause. So just a little review of the waves here. Surface waves go across the earth. P waves can go through anything, but S waves can only go through the mantle and the crust. Shallow earthquakes tend to be anywhere within the first 70 kilometers of the Earth's surface. And intermediate focus earthquakes tend to be between 70 and 300 kilometers deep, and then deep focus earthquakes are from 300 to 650 kilometers deep. Which one of these do you think would cause the most damage? Did you figure it out? Shallow focus earthquakes cause the most damage because they have the strongest vibrations and they reach the surface more quickly. Just like if you're standing in front of an amp that's really loud, it's going to do the most damage if you're standing close to it. So the sound waves don't have as far to travel and they're still strong. Deep focus earthquakes are the weakest because their vibrations usually lose a lot of their energy as they travel the distance to get to the surface. And intermediate or somewhere in between. So last but not least, I want to talk about the types of faults. We're going to talk about normal, reverse, or thrust, and strike slip. So normal faults are when two plates are moving apart. That is also known as tension. And these faults, there's one right there. Here's an example. Tend to be associated with a boundary that has tension on it. Can you guys think of which boundary has tension? You're right. The divergent boundary is when the plates are moving apart. Other earthquakes, so there's another more normal fault. Another type of earthquake is the thrust fault, and this is where the two plates are moving together. So would that be compression, tension, or shearing? You got it. It's compression, just like if you pushed a piece of paper on both ends. And those are just showing some of that. So what type of boundary do you think that would happen at? You're right, convergent. And that's a kind of a cool picture of a track where a thrust fault happened. And then strike slip is when they shear past each other. And in this case, it's not compression or tension, it's shearing that is causing this. And these, check out how this river got offset during an event. And the type of boundary where these happen is, you're right, transform. So there's another one. These are some trees that were planted and they got offset. I don't know if you noticed how they're not in a straight line anymore. And there's a farmer's field after an earthquake where there was shearing going on. So that's it for your notes, and I hope you have a good evening. Bye.